Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. My name is Casey Dunn. I'm 43 years old and I live in Clarksburg, West Virginia. Before the world went quiet, I worked as a radio technician and emergency communications consultant. I've always had a thing for shortwave, amateur radio, the hum and crackle of a signal pushing through static. There's something comforting about the invisible web of human voices bouncing off the ionosphere, until one day, all those voices disappeared. It happened on a Tuesday morning, July 9th. The weather had been hot and dry for weeks. I remember it was 7:42 a.m. because I just brewed my second cup of coffee and was logging into the emergency repeater station database from my work laptop. That's when it hit, an electromagnetic pulse. No warning, no rumble, no distant thunder. Just a sudden flicker, like every screen blinked in unison, then went dark. Not just mine, everything. My LED bulb overhead popped like a flashbulb. My laptop screen died in a millisecond. Even the little LCD clock on the microwave faded to black. Outside, silence rolled through town like a fog. No car engines, no compressors humming at the gas station, no HVAC systems. It was the kind of silence that doesn't belong in a town. The first thing I did was reach for my Yaesu FT891 rig. It's a solid HF transceiver, built tough, with minimal reliance on computer integration. I'd taken precautions, kept it in a Faraday cage in my basement, along with a solar-powered battery bank and two handheld Baofeng UV5Rs wrapped in aluminum mesh and mylar. Paranoia or foresight? I guess that's debatable now. I bolted to the basement and peeled back the Faraday shielding. When I powered up the transceiver with the battery system, I held my breath. The screen flickered and lit up. A miracle. One of the few pieces of tech left intact. The bands were chaos. Static ruled the waves. No NOAA weather station on 162.550 MHz. No VHF police dispatch. No ham operators calling CQ. Just faint traces of what sounded like high-altitude interference. Natural stuff, no human signal. Like someone had plucked the planet's vocal cords. Outside, neighbours were already gathering. My next-door neighbour, Trina, was standing on her porch in scrubs, her hands on her hips. She's a nurse at United Hospital Centre just off Route 50. Across the street, Mr. Rourke was checking his truck, trying to turn the ignition over and over with no success. Every vehicle in sight, dead. I walked across the lawn and asked the question on everyone's mind. Your phones work? Blank stares. Nobody had a signal. No bars. Nothing loaded. And anything newer than a 95 Toyota, completely bricked. Trina joined me and said what we were all thinking. EMP? I nodded slowly. Looks like it. By noon, the scale of the damage was becoming clear. No power, no phones, no radio or television broadcasts, no communication coming in or going out, no word from Charleston, no word from DC. Even the AM/FM bands were silent, the towers either fried or shut down. I helped organise a small meeting at the old volunteer fire hall on West Pike Street. We gathered anyone nearby, families, elderly folks, a couple of ex-military guys, and a few local business owners who had perishable goods in their freezers. People were scared, and I was too, but I tried to keep calm. I had some knowledge that could help. I stood up and explained the basics of what an EMP is. Electromagnetic pulse, usually caused by a high-altitude nuclear detonation. We're not talking radiation down here. This wasn't a ground burst, but it was enough to fry unshielded electronics across the grid. Most modern systems are vulnerable. Cars, planes, power stations, data centers. Even GPS satellites might be offline. But who did it? Someone shouted. I didn't answer, because the truth is, we didn't know. By the second day, The town had split into two groups, the ones who still hoped help was coming, and the ones who started acting like help wasn't. You could see the lines forming like tectonic plates beneath our feet. I stuck with a small crew, me, Trina the nurse, a guy named Joel, former army infantry who ran a hardware store down on Milford Street, old Mr. Rourke, who used to be a ham operator in the 80s and had a surprisingly large stash of vacuum tube gear in his garage. And then there was Camilla, a 27-year-old mechanic who had rebuilt a diesel generator from parts she'd scavenged from a junkyard out near Bridgeport. Our group set up in an old church on South Chestnut Street, thick stone walls, wide basement, and the steeple, a perfect place to string up a long wire antenna. With the working transceiver, I began scanning again. I bounced from 10 meters to 80 meters, listening, waiting. Days passed. Then finally, on the 5th night, I heard it. Clarksburg, this is station Juliet Sierra 8. Repeat, Juliet Sierra 8. Secure relay broadcast. My heart stopped. It was faint, buried in static, but undeniably human. Someone was transmitting. I noted the call sign and logged it in my field book. Joel stared over my shoulder, silently mouthing the letters. "What's JS8?" he asked. I looked at him. "That's military protocol. Juliet Sierra is joint signal. Could be National Guard. Could be something else." We began monitoring 5.000 megahertz every night after that, using narrowband settings and patience. The signal repeated like a beacon. Same timestamp, same phrase, but no dialogue. No way to transmit back without drawing attention. Still, it meant someone, somewhere, had equipment, and maybe they were looking for survivors. By the end of the first week, the town had changed. No gas, no functioning grocery stores. What food remained had to be rationed. Trina worked non-stop tending to injured people. Those with diabetic complications, heat stroke, infections from minor injuries. Without refrigeration or medicine deliveries, her job was triage. Joel started organizing perimeter patrols, not against some fantasy threat, but real concerns. Looters, desperate folks passing through from the highways. We didn't want to turn away people in need, but we also didn't have enough to share blindly. We began to use radios for local comms, my Baofengs, recharged by Camilla's solar array. Channels were pre-programmed with analog CTCSS tones, and we kept them off unless in use, limiting signal leakage. It felt like wartime protocol. On July 15th, we had our first major encounter. A convoy of about 15 people arrived from Morgantown. They said the university had been hit hard. Most students had fled. The power plant went dark within hours. Rumors were spreading. Pittsburgh was gone, burned out from riots. Columbus had been evacuated. No one knew about Washington. Some claimed to have seen helicopters over the mountains, black, unmarked. The leader of the group, a man named Marcus, wore an old sheriff's badge from Monongalia County. Said he'd served as a deputy. Lost half his team in the first 2 days when the jail backup generators failed and the locks jammed shut. He wasn't here to cause trouble, just asking for help. We took in 6 of his group, including 2 kids and an injured woman. The woman's name was Roslyn, mid-30s, looked like she hadn't slept in days. Her left leg was wrapped in torn denim soaked with iodine. A jagged metal shard had slashed her thigh during a highway pileup on I-79 near Fairmont. She was lucky it hadn't severed her femoral artery, but without antibiotics, the wound was swelling badly. Trina took her to the back of the church and started cleaning it again with the dwindling supply of betadine and the last of the sterile gauze. We had no sutures, so she closed the worst of it, with fishing lines sterilized over a flame. She never complained, not even when her hands trembled from exhaustion. The 2 kids they brought in, siblings named Aaron and Lacey, hadn't spoken much. Their father had died trying to push-start a dead pickup truck during a storm. A downed power line, live somehow, made contact with the wet frame just as he was leaning in. According to Marcus, the mother had disappeared the day after that. The kids were shell-shocked, silent shadows who clung to each other like magnets. Trina set them up with blankets and gave them small portions of the peanut butter and oats we'd stockpiled from abandoned homes. Joel and I kept watch that night. We sat on the roof of the church with binoculars and radios, eyes scanning the darkened streets. Even the stars looked colder than usual. No moon, just the whisper of wind across asphalt and broken glass. Joel smoked his last cigar, something he'd saved since day one. "They'll come eventually," he said, as if trying to reassure himself more than me. "Who?" I asked. "The government." He shook his head. "No, the ones we don't want." By the following morning, a few more people had arrived, stragglers from the east. One man had pushed a makeshift cart nearly 30 miles from Philippi, loaded with bottled water and a weather-worn topo map of the region. He said Route 250 was completely blocked by abandoned vehicles and debris. There'd been shooting near the Grafton interchange. Nobody knew if it was looters or something worse. He passed out from heat exhaustion shortly after arriving, and we set him up in the church hall with the others. Clarksburg's survival now depended on managing three things: water, food, and silence. We tapped into the old well behind the church. It had been capped for decades, but Joel and Camilla managed to rig a manual hand pump using salvaged PVC piping and a rope bucket system. The water came up cloudy at first, but after filtering it through layered charcoal, sand and cloth, we boiled it and tested it with old aqua tabs. No one got sick, so we kept at it. Food was trickier. The grocery stores had been emptied within the first 72 hours. Gas-powered vehicles were dead, so we used bikes and carts to scout local houses. We avoided breaking doors or windows, only entered homes that looked already abandoned or were left open. We left notes where we could, listing what we'd taken and where to find us. It wasn't perfect, but it was what passed for ethics these days. We found canned beans, dried lentils, rice, salt, boxes of powdered milk, and even a 50-pound bag of flour at a hunting cabin up near Maple Lake. I also managed to salvage several foil-wrapped MREs from an old retired Army Ranger's basement. He'd written, "For the real end," on each one in permanent marker. Silence, though. That was the hardest part. Radios were a blessing and a curse. Every time we transmitted, we risked drawing attention. We used low power settings and directional antennas, and even then, only at night. My Morse code beacons went out in 5-second bursts every 3 hours, always on a different band, always encrypted with a basic one-time pad cipher I'd written by hand. I didn't care if they were intercepted. I just needed to know if someone was alive out there and listening. On July 18th, I received a response that shook me. Clarksburg identified, relay active, LZ Charlie, 3 days, 2100 hours, Red Cross verified. It was sent in Morse, faint but deliberate, on 14.070 MHz. Whoever sent it had both power and protocol. I repeated the message to Joel, and he studied the handwritten translation I scrawled on my notepad. "LZ Charlie?" he asked. "Landing zone," I said. "Could mean a drone drop, could mean a manned chopper, could be bait too." Camilla was more skeptical. "No way they know who we are unless someone talked." That was the fear. If someone we'd taken in had used our signal to relay info to someone else, we could be exposed. But something about the phrasing felt official. Red Cross verified wasn't a phrase a drifter would use. We spent the next 2 days scouting high ground. Joel identified a spot near the abandoned armory past the edge of Glen Elk, an old overgrown field with just enough flat surface for a small VTOL to land. We sent a team to watch the area from a tree line half a mile away, just in case. On the third night, exactly at 2100, the sky lit up with a sound I hadn't heard since before the blackout. A low mechanical whine. Joel spotted it first. A quad-rotor drone, military grade, possibly an MQ-8C Fire Scout. It hovered above the clearing for 15 seconds, then dropped a package using a tethered winch before zipping westward into the darkness. We retrieved the drop under cover of night. Inside the crate, sealed in a padded container, were 6 water purification pumps, 12 IV kits, a dozen vacuum-sealed MREs, a pack of hard-copy Red Cross field manuals, and a laminated message. Remain dark, maintain local order, additional drop TBD, station JS-8M relays active in sector. This was the first official sign of a functioning national effort, and it meant someone still had command structure, coordination, and a mission. But it also meant we were not as invisible as we thought. After the drop, we increased security. Our perimeter team expanded to 20 people, rotating watches day and night, with scouts on rooftops along the Monongahela River trails. We'd built motion alarms out of fishing line, soda cans, and nails, low-tech, but reliable. That's when the radio changed. Static began filling channels that had been quiet for weeks. At first, we thought it was atmospheric interference. Then I picked up repeated signals on 462.6125 M8s, the old GMRS emergency channel. The voice was male, heavily distorted, possibly altered digitally. It repeated the same phrase over and over. Route the ashes to Station North, signal when clean. Route the ashes to Station North, signal when clean. Joel and I didn't know what to make of it. The frequency wasn't encrypted, but the message was clearly coded. Worse, it kept looping every 19 minutes, never deviating. It didn't sound like any Red Cross or FEMA pattern. Camilla suggested it might be an AI-driven repeater, something automated to run until someone replied with the right code. I didn't answer it, not yet. Instead, I began scanning nearby locations, Morgantown, Weston, Elkins, looking for similar loops or secondary codes. A few faint signals came back on the 40-meter band, too garbled to fully make out. One phrase, however, was unmistakable. Ashfall protocol is in effect. That was when I began to worry. I didn't know what Ashfall protocol was, but it didn't sound like a recovery operation. It sounded like something worse, something final, like a cleanup order. We kept this to ourselves, just me, Joel, and Trina. No one else needed to panic, not yet. The group had grown to nearly 60 people, all packed into the church and 2 nearby houses we had cleared and fortified. Too many of them depended on stability. If they knew something larger and more dangerous was moving in the shadows of this blackout, fear would tear everything we'd built apart. The radio message continued its loop on 462.6125 MHz, unwavering, mechanical. Route the ashes to Station North, signal when clean, over and over. Every 19 minutes, I logged the transmissions in a notebook I kept beside the rig, noting signal strength and shifts in atmospheric clarity. I changed the antenna angle slightly each night, searching for triangulation clues. If I had to guess, the broadcast was somewhere within 50 to 70 miles, north-northwest, maybe in the direction of Wheeling or even across the Ohio River. It was Camilla who suggested we look at it from a systems angle. She had worked briefly as a data analyst for a logistics company before switching to full-time mechanical work. She didn't say much in meetings, but when she did, people listened. She pulled out an old road atlas we'd salvaged from a county office and laid it across the table. "If this is a logistics command," she said, pointing to the central corridor formed by I-79 and US-19, "then Station North is likely part of a route hierarchy. It's either a hub, a relay, or a clean zone." The phrase's signal when clean could imply biological decontamination. Or ideological, Joel added grimly. I stared at the map. There were dozens of small towns and infrastructure points scattered across the route. Fairmont, Morgantown, Moundsville, St. Clairsville, just across the state line. Before the blackout, these places were just blips on a highway sign. Now, they were puzzle pieces in a grid we couldn't fully see. If this Ashfall protocol was a real operation, military or otherwise, it wasn't being broadcast publicly. No announcements, no civilian warnings, no aid stations. Just code. Trina was quiet most of the evening, seated at the corner of the room, reading over the Red Cross manual from the drop. Then, as I was flipping to the VHF log sheet, she said something that made me stop cold. I heard that phrase before, she said. Ashfall, years ago, during training at UHC. I turned to her. You sure? She nodded, eyes fixed on the floor. It was part of a disaster response drill we did. Mostly just paperwork. What to do in the event of mass exposure, chemical or biological. One of the drills was labelled Operation Ashfall. I remember it because the name stuck with me. It sounded final. I leaned forward, trying to keep my voice steady. What kind of response? They told us it was hypothetical, but the basics were quarantine, decontamination, and containment. If exposure exceeded protocol thresholds, there was no evacuation, only isolation, lockdown. Anyone who couldn't be confirmed clean was listed as non-transportable. That's what they called it. We all sat in silence for a moment, the weight of her words cutting deeper than any siren ever could. The next morning, Joel and I took a recon team west toward Route 20. We used mountain bikes scavenged from a local sporting goods store and carried lightweight gear, radios, a spotting scope, a topographical map, and a suppressed bolt-action rifle Joel had retrieved from a friend's cabin weeks earlier. We weren't looking for confrontation, only answers. We reached the outskirts of Lumberport by mid-afternoon, staying off the roads, following tree lines and elevation contours. The town was quiet, far too quiet. Many buildings were burned out. Cars sat rusting in driveways or crumpled at intersections. It was hard to tell how much of the damage was from early chaos and how much had occurred more recently. Signs of looting were everywhere, but something else caught our attention. Order. Unlike the random vandalism we'd seen in Clarksburg during the first week, this destruction had a pattern. Entry points were carefully breached, not smashed. Supplies were stripped, not scattered. Doors were opened, not kicked in. It looked like someone had moved through the area methodically, cleaning house. We found a trail of spray-painted symbols on doors and garage frames, small red triangles with a single vertical slash through the center. Always the same size, always the same height off the ground. I took pictures with a disposable camera we kept for mapping. Camilla later identified the symbol as almost identical to those used in hazmat procedures by NATO forces. A unit identifier for contaminated but contained sites. We didn't linger. The deeper we went into Lumberport, the worse it felt, like we were walking through someone else's footprint and they were only a few hours ahead of us. We returned before nightfall. That evening, I updated the group during our core meeting, minus the mention of Ashfall protocol to the larger community. No sense in setting off alarms just yet. But among the inner circle, we began prepping for a real evacuation strategy, just in case. 2 days later, the church was visited by someone we didn't expect, a man named Thomas Whitaker, a former Department of Energy contractor who had gone off-grid years before the blackout. He arrived on foot with a long walking staff, heavy canvas coat, and a crude but functional signal analyzer hanging from his belt. I recognized the unit, a handheld spectrum analyzer, the kind once used for identifying unlicensed radio broadcasts and rogue cell towers. It still worked because it was analog-based, with vacuum tubes and self-contained shielding. He told us he'd been tracking the EMP fallout across multiple towns in West Virginia and eastern Ohio. He claimed there were at least 4 high-altitude bursts, not one. Each one was spaced approximately 600 miles apart in a grid designed to maximize electromagnetic coverage, without direct physical destruction. He didn't know who launched them, but he did know what came next. The EMP was the net, he said, sipping from a tin mug. Ashfall is the rake. He'd intercepted the same broadcast we had, 462.6125 MAs, and a handful of others just like it. Identical phrasing, slightly different timing and routing codes. Each one correlated with a vector of population centers along major interstates. He mapped it for us with chalk on the stone floor of the church basement, drawing lines and coordinates. It all pointed north. Then he handed me something that chilled my blood. A classified operations memo, printed, sealed in a waterproof pouch, and clearly marked as restricted. He wouldn't say where he got it, but he assured us it was real. The heading read, U.S. Continuity of Government Program Protocol, Code, Ashfall, Clearance, Level 3 Eyes Only, Operational Mandate. In the event of sustained grid-down scenarios caused by EMP or cyber-based infrastructure failure, Protocol Ashfall is to be initiated by regional authority nodes. Objectives: isolate population clusters unable to achieve stable order, prevent mass migration to Tier 1 government continuity sites, deploy signal scramblers, and reroute comms to Station North or Station Delta based on infection metrics. Route civilians flagged as unverified to clean zones for assessment or neutral containment. At the bottom was a date, July 5th, 4 days before the blackout. I didn't sleep that night. Trina and Joel stayed up with me, reviewing the document again and again. What disturbed me the most wasn't that the government had such a plan. It was that it had been printed before the lights went out. This wasn't a response. It was part of the opening move. We had a hard choice ahead: keep our heads down and hope to be overlooked, or move, but moving nearly 60 people, many of them children or elderly, across dangerous roads with no vehicles and limited food. That was a death sentence unless we had a destination, and if all the clean zones were just waypoints to containment centres, then there was nowhere safe to go. On July 24th, we made our decision. We would remain dark, as the memo advised, but not passive. We'd expand our perimeter, reinforce our stronghold, build redundancies in communication and defence. Camilla was already drawing up plans for a gravity-fed water system using rain catchment tanks and copper pipe. Joel began training small groups in basic radio operations, hand signalling and fallback positions. I started preparing for a long-range trip. Someone needed to go north, confirm what Station North really was. I volunteered. Trina didn't like it, but she understood. I took one of the Baofangs, 2 days worth of MREs, a topo map, the bolt-action rifle, and the disposable camera with the lumberport markings. My objective wasn't sabotage or contact. It was intelligence. I left just after sunrise, moving westward through the quiet outskirts of Clarksburg with the long morning shadows stretching like fingers behind me. The plan was simple: cross Route 20 north of Hepzibah and stay off the major roads, working my way toward the Ohio River through forest trails and secondary roads that hadn't seen regular use in decades. I'd marked a few likely waypoints on the map: old fire towers, maintenance roads, and rail spurs, and committed the larger regional grid to memory in case I had to ditch the paper copy. My first day was uneventful. I passed through the skeletal remains of Worthington by early afternoon, staying clear of the centre and skirting behind the rail depot. The houses there had been stripped clean, not violently, just systematically. Drawers emptied, doors left ajar, appliances gutted. Whoever came through had been deliberate, like they knew what they were looking for. That pattern again. I spent the night on the second floor of an abandoned barn overlooking a dried creek bed just west of Edomai. It had once been someone's homestead, and I found an old kerosene lantern hanging under the rafters, dusty but intact. I didn't light it. No fires, no flashes, no scent trails if I could help it. I ate half an MRE cold and spent 2 hours listening to the Baofeng for any sign of activity, just the faint hiss of open air. By the second morning, I reached a ridgeline that offered a clear view of the river basin to the north. From there, I saw it, far off, at the edge of visibility, through a break in the trees, a tall antenna structure, probably 200 feet high, rising above a large compound flanked by fencing and what looked like guard towers. The angle and proximity to the river suggested it was somewhere near Proctor or Hannibal, close to the Ohio-West Virginia border. I marked the bearing on my compass and began descending through a network of game trails toward the valley. The area surrounding the compound was unnaturally quiet. Even birdsong thinned out the closer I got. It took me a full day of cautious movement to get within visual recon distance. I found shelter on a wooded slope about 600 yards away from the southern perimeter. Through the spotting scope, I could make out rows of Quonset huts, 3 armoured Humvees parked in a gravel lot, and a steel gate with a keypad access terminal. A generator hummed in the background, large, industrial, and likely running off diesel. The whole facility was surrounded by a high chain-link fence topped with razor wire, and at least 2 patrols circled its edge on a regular schedule. No flags, no insignias, no civilian markings, just anonymous, institutional grey. And then I saw them. People, maybe 20 of them, lined up inside a courtyard in front of one of the larger structures. They were being processed, body scans, visual inspections, some kind of testing protocol involving handheld devices. They weren't restrained, but the soldiers, because that's what they were, even without uniforms, carried rifles slung at the ready. One by one, individuals were either waved through a side gate or pulled aside into a secondary building I hadn't seen before. No one came out of that one. Ever. This wasn't a relief station. It wasn't a refugee hub or a decontamination site. It was a filter. I watched for hours as more small groups were brought in, on foot or in beat-up transport trucks, often escorted. Always the same process. Examination, sorting, and rerouting. The phrase from the radio message echoed in my mind. Signal when clean. I stayed for 2 days, hidden in that slope, watching, documenting what I could through the camera's viewfinder. I kept the Baofeng powered down, only checking it periodically in bursts to avoid being scanned. On the morning of the 3rd day, something changed. A convoy of 3 matte black vehicles arrived, 2 transport trucks and a boxy command SUV with blacked out windows. Unlike the previous movements, this one brought tension with it. The entire facility seemed to snap to a higher level of alert. Personnel moved with urgency. New guards appeared on the tower platforms, and the courtyard was cleared completely. From the SUV, a group of people emerged, only partially visible through the scope. 2 men and a woman, all wearing long coats, none in military dress. One of the men held a briefcase and was speaking animatedly to the others while pointing at a clipboard. Whatever they were doing, it wasn't standard operating procedure. I snapped 4 quick shots and then packed up. It was time to leave. I had seen enough. I spent the next 5 days working my way back south, moving slower, more cautiously. I wasn't being followed, at least I didn't think so, but paranoia clung to me like sweat. I avoided roads completely, even trails, and started sleeping under brush or in hollow trees when I could find them. On the 3rd night, I found an old ranger station north of Wallace. The interior had been gutted, but the basement was intact, and it offered enough cover to catch 4 hours of sleep before I moved again. Back in Clarksburg, they had fortified the church. Joel and Camilla had reinforced the windows with salvaged steel shutters and added another water barrel to the rooftop filtration system. The population had grown again. Word of the safe zone was spreading, not on the radio, but through whispers, travelers, and old-fashioned word of mouth. We were now housing nearly 80 people, including 2 women who'd delivered babies in the last week, a teenage boy who'd lost both his parents near Grafton, and a retired meteorologist who had walked nearly 60 miles on a broken ankle. I briefed Joel and Trina first. We spread the disposable camera negatives out under a makeshift red light and examined the images. The compound was real. The people, the patrols, the inspections, all of it. The facility near the river was stationed north. There was no longer any doubt. Trina's face paled when she saw the photo of the individuals being pulled aside into the 2nd building. "That's not triage," she said. "That's a blacklist." We debated what to do, whether to warn people off or fortify ourselves even more. Camilla made the suggestion we'd all been too afraid to speak out loud, go completely off the map, abandon Clarksburg, fragment into smaller mobile groups, and disappear before the grid came sweeping through. Joel argued against it. He believed we had a better shot building something stable than starting from scratch in the wild. He wasn't wrong, but neither was she. That night, I broadcast one final message over the shortwave band, encoded and brief. Station North confirmed, not safe. Civilian screening permanent. Clarksburg dark. Do not respond. Maintain 0 signal. I shut down the rig and packed it in foam. From now on, we'd use the radios only for immediate local comms and emergencies. Everything else, silent. Over the next week, we began preparing quietly. Supply caches were hidden in waterproof drums and buried near known landmarks. Escape routes were mapped, coded, and committed to memory. Trina and another volunteer began putting together low-tech medkits using charcoal filters, hand-sewn gauze, and alcohol tinctures. Camilla began work on a crude wind-powered generator using parts from a broken ATV and a salvaged alternator. Joel built decoy signal emitters using stripped VHF boards, wired to solar motion lights. So if anyone did come looking for our broadcast signal, they'd find only static and ghosts. We weren't fighting a war, not in the way people used to understand it. We were staying alive while something else, something colder and larger than any of us, moved across the map, sterilizing the world of uncertainty, rewriting the rules of who was allowed to remain and who wasn't. The blackout was just the beginning. It wasn't meant to kill us. It was meant to erase us, slowly, efficiently, while making sure no one else ever knew we were here. On the last clear night of August, nearly 2 months after the lights died, I climbed to the top of the steeple and looked out over the quiet town. Somewhere out there, a machine was still repeating the phrase, "Route the ashes to Station North, signal when clean." And here, in this fragment of an old world, we waited, unheard and unmarked, our signal silent, our voices quiet. We were still alive, for now. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepypastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.